Michigan football, the most winningest team in college football history, owner of one of the biggest stadiums in the world, one of the most valuable college programs in the country. Love them or hate them, you have to respect what they've built and how they've continued to be one of the better teams in the country, even 144 years after fielding their first team. I wanted to start looking into some of these older schools, the ones who were able to rack up wins early in college football. I've heard rumors from doing some research that way back in the day, some established programs would go spread football to other schools, beat them by like 100 points, and then count the win to their overall record. Being someone who doesn't know a lot about college football history and is trying to learn, I wanted to see if there was any truth to these claims. So I started my journey with the school that's had more wins than any other team in football, the Michigan Wolverines. Easily enough, I saw that pretty early on, they started finding some great success on the field, even claiming a few national titles. I mean, who hasn't claimed a few national titles in the early 1900s? It seems like every season there were at least 3 national champions. When I started to look into the seasons, I knew I was going to find something good. From 1901 through 1905, they annihilated opponents. They would have games where they scored over 100 points 4 different times, and got close to 100 points a handful of other times. And these weren't brand new programs that they were beating. Some of these teams had no business losing this badly. In 1901, no team even scored a point on them. I was starting to question how these outrageous scores could even happen. This was an era of football where the games looked more like rugby matches, and Michigan was playing against competitive teams at the time. This led me down a rabbit hole that I wasn't expecting. I started looking into their coach at the time, Fielding Yost. Who was this guy? What could he possibly have done to lead a team like Michigan to 6 national titles and 10 conference championships? Fielding Yost was born in April of 1871 in Fairview, Virginia. His father was a Confederate soldier who after the war ran a small store in West Virginia that would do fairly well due to the oil boom. As a teenager, he attended Fairmont Normal School and Ohio Normal School. He was active at these schools, playing baseball and other sports. He eventually applied to West Virginia University's law school, where he was first introduced to college football. Being 6 feet tall and 200 pounds at the time made Yost bigger than a lot of his peers. He was convinced to join the football team, and it was love at first sight. Yost would play tackle for West Virginia in 1896. He was known as someone who studied the rulebook as if he were a lawyer, always having a great understanding of the rules. Realizing he was a great player, he ended up playing for 3 different teams in this one season, including West Virginia, a 3A team for the Allegheny Athletic Association located in Pittsburgh, and Lafayette College in Easton, Pennsylvania. People like to describe this period in football as the Wild West. The best team typically pulled crazy stunts that would never fly in today's game. The different leagues weren't as regulated back then, so it was easier to get away with things. While Yost played for Lafayette, he enrolled at the university for only 1 week. After playing 4 games in 1 week, he would transfer back to West Virginia, claiming that he liked the law school better at West Virginia than the engineering school at Lafayette. West Virginia had played Lafayette that season in 3 games over 3 days, losing all 3 of them. During the first game, Yost got hit over the eye and had to get 7 stitches to close it up. He said that for the next game, he had to play with a beefsteak covering his eye. The doctor wouldn't let him play in the 3rd game. Lafayette coach Park Dink Davis was impressed with Yost and convinced him to join the team for the big game they had coming up with one of the best teams in the country, Penn. Lafayette would end up beating them with Yost being a contributing factor. One of Yost's schoolmates at the time wrote that when Yost returned from Lafayette, he was on crutches, head in a bandage, looking like a veteran returning from the Western Front. Players transferring like this was a common phenomenon at the time, and these players were called tramp athletes. They would essentially transfer to a school just to play football with no intention of attending the school for academics. This is something Yost was used to, and he would use tramp athletes throughout his coaching career. After this season, Yost got into coaching. His plan was only to coach for 2 to 3 seasons, to travel and see as much of the country as he could. Coaching wasn't considered a real job at the time. There was only one full-time coach in the country, and it was Amos Stagg of the University of Chicago. Everyone else was part-time and made little money. Yost's first stop would be at Ohio Wesleyan in 1897, where he led the team to a 7-1-1 record, tying a strong Michigan team and beating Ohio State. Yost would declare them champions of Ohio, even though their only loss that season was to Oberlin, which was an Ohio team. Yost's performance impressed the public, and he used the Ohio Wesleyan job as leverage to get a job as the Nebraska head coach for the 1898 season. Yost would be described as arrogant and cocky throughout most of his career. He loved any publicity he could get, and he constantly strived to impress those around him. He supposedly liked to keep a scrapbook of his press clippings from all of his seasons as a makeshift resume to bring the job interviews. When he started at Nebraska, they weren't called the Nebraska Cornhuskers. No, they were the ferocious Nebraska Bug Eaters. He coached Nebraska to a 7-3 record, winning the Missouri Valley Championship and beating their top rival, Kansas. Nebraska would love Yost, but couldn't keep him due to finances. Yost would end up only getting paid $160 of the $500 promised to him for the 1898 season. Yost almost quit coaching because of this to go work in the oil business until the team he just upset, Kansas, found out he was looking for a job. They offered him the head coach position and he accepted. He coached at Kansas for the 1899 season. He was on campus during the same time that James Naismith, the inventor of basketball, was coaching Kansas's basketball team. Yost would have another great year, going undefeated, beating both of Kansas's rivals, Nebraska and Missouri. He outscored opponents 280-37. The school again couldn't afford to pay him, but they wrote him a good recommendation to go coach out west at Stanford, who would hire him for the 1900 season. Yost approached the Stanford job with a strong desire to win because a year prior, he was turned down by Stanford. That season, he would go 7-2-1, outscoring opponents 154-20. He would help coach 4 total teams out west that season. One was Stanford, the next was their freshman team that would go 6-0. He would also help coach at Lowell High School of San Francisco in the mornings. Finally, a few evenings a week, he would also coach the San Jose College team. All 4 teams won their respective championships that season. He supposedly also helped coach the Uki High School team while he was nearby deer hunting that year. The guy loved football. Stanford wouldn't retain him because of pressure from the school and conference to only have alumni coach the team. He tried to coach at Illinois because he had connections there, but they had already filled their vacancies for the season. They would refer him to Michigan though because they knew they were still in need of a coach. Yost sent Michigan a scrapbook weighing nearly 50 pounds, including his football achievements and letters of recommendation. They would end up hiring him where he would get paid a salary of $2,300 plus a sum sufficient to cover his living expenses in Ann Arbor during the season. This was around the same salary as a campus professor at the time, and keep in mind, Yost only had to work for 10 weeks out of the year. Professors couldn't believe that a sports team coach was getting paid the same amount as them. For most of his coaching career, Yost would be considered part-time. During the offseason, he would go back down south and work on various business ventures. When he took the Michigan job, he was an oil prospector back in West Virginia in the offseason. Michigan fired their previous coach after he went 7-2. He lost to their closest rival at the time, Chicago, and finished 5th in the conference, which was the Big Ten, but at the time was called the Western Conference. I will call the Big Ten both the Big Ten and the Western Conference throughout the video. Michigan pulled the trigger on one of the biggest questions modern teams still face today. Do we fire our average coach in hopes of getting an elite one? Sometimes it works out, and the new coach brings your team to greatness. Sometimes your next coach is even worse than the old one and makes your program slip further and further down. They hired Yost to gamble on a potentially elite coach. Yost would start out with a bang in the 1901 season, leading Michigan to an undefeated season, outscoring opponents 550-0. Yeah, that's right. Not only did they not allow any points for the entire season, but the team would be nicknamed the point-a-minute team, and they were technically averaging over a point a minute. They even had a game against Buffalo, where they beat them 128-0. Michigan would go on to play the first ever Rose Bowl against Yost's old school, Stanford. The game was a big deal at the time, and highly anticipated. Cross-country games were very rare. The organizers of the Rose Bowl at the time tried their best to bring in a large crowd and grow its excitement. They had the game played close to Christmas, had a huge parade, and turned the game into a big event. Michigan would win 49-0 in a huge upset. This game showed how different Yost's gameplay style was compared to other schools at the time, and why they were beating teams so badly. He was an expert at running a program and paid great attention to every detail he could control. First off, they ran a hurry-up offense, quickly gassing Stanford. Michigan was in great shape and was able to use signals from the sideline, like teams do today, to call the plays. They also punted the ball very well, causing Stanford to fumble and turn the ball over on multiple punt returns. Yost noticed that Stanford's right tackle was weak, and after halftime, he relentlessly attacked that player's side of the ball. Spectators commented on how Michigan made no mistakes during the game and didn't have any turnovers. Once Michigan was up 28-0, Yost felt more confident and started to get creative, running what during that day was still considered trick plays, such as fake kicks, double passes, and wing plays. Stanford also noted how low the Michigan players played during the game and how easily they were able to outmuscle Stanford's team and push them back. A lot of players at the time stood higher up while playing, which is the opposite of what they teach you today. Their defense was also very strong. They were one of the first teams to use a linebacker. This was something that happened on accident while at practice, and Yost would end up using it during the games. His players realized that they could better read the ball carrier if they started a few yards off the ball. Michigan would win every game from 1901 to 1905 until the final game of that 1905 season, where they would lose to their biggest rival, Chicago, 2-0. Those 2 points would be the only points scored on them that season. The success from 1901 to 1905 put Michigan on the map, and they started to make more money from the football team. In prior seasons, Michigan had to rely on loans from alumni and boosters just to keep their athletic department afloat. With the revenue from the crowds they brought in for some of these games like the Rose Bowl or their matchups with Chicago, they were able to turn a profit and start to make money off of football. Many at Michigan liked the new popularity that came from their now elite football team, but some people didn't like it, not wanting to be associated with football and thinking that it took away from the academic side of the university. Yost would fight these criticisms for most of his career to grow the game of football and attempt to change the public perception of it. He wanted people to understand that football could grow young men into better people, and how nothing prepared someone for the adversities of life quite like football does. In 1905, Yost would write a book called Football for Players and Spectre. Yost wrote the book as a way to teach people about football and also as a guide for players and coaches to get better. The book teaches the reader about football and all the things you need to understand to build a great team. The book shows how much attention to detail Yost showed in his coaching and provides a lot of evidence as to why his teams were so successful. The book includes detailed descriptions of each position and how to play them. Yost describes the different aspects of the game, such as tackling, throwing, running, and kicking. He hand-drew plays with explanations on how to run them. He also dove into his philosophy on how to build a successful team. He covered areas like how hard to train your players, how they should eat, sleep, and take care of themselves, what types of assistant coaches to find, how to pick captains, and even list out how a typical game week should go. This book surprised me and had a lot of helpful information that I think would still greatly benefit teams today. Yost recognized that people learn differently and that the same approach won't work for every player. If you take your time working on each player, then it'll take less time to get the team to play together as a whole. He compared it to working on a car. If you work on each piece individually, the car will eventually work well together as one whole machine. My favorite quote from the book was, "If football answered no other purpose than that of drawing hundreds of thousands into the open air, away from offices and shops, drawing rooms and clubs, for a few health-giving hours, this would be reason enough for its existence." After writing this book, Yost would send it to various journalists as a way for them to review the book and advertise it. It would work, spreading the book quickly, and he would start becoming recognized as one of the best coaches in the country. The president during this time was Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt loved the game of football and was convinced that it was positive for the country as a whole. But with the current way it was played, the public would never allow it to continue due to its brutality. It was reported that between 1901 and 1904, there were 68 deaths and 804 incapacitating injuries from football. Roosevelt decided to meet with some of the top coaches and university presidents in the country to try to find a way to make the game safer for the public. Through these meetings, the NCAA was born, created as a way to foster a safer game for the players and also create a more even playing field for other programs to get involved. It was initially called the Intercollegiate Athletic Association of the United States and was changed to the NCAA, or the National Collegiate Athletic Association, in 1910. During this time, many conferences introduced their own set of rules to do their part in making the game more regulated. In 1906, the Big Ten, or the Western Conference, proposed a few changes that did not sit well with Yost and Michigan. They proposed new rules, such as banning training tables, which was where teams ate meals together, allowing only 3 seasons of player eligibility, shortening the season to only 5 games, and the biggest change, banning full-time professional coaches and only allowing tenured professors to coach. Michigan and Yost felt like most of these rules were targeted towards Yost due to his cocky public persona. As I said earlier, Yost only coached part-time and ran different businesses in the offseason. Michigan felt like this was a personal attack on them, and with support from the university and the fan base, they decided to leave the Western Conference and play as an independent in 1907. They reasoned that not only did Michigan want to keep their great coach, but they also didn't want to get passed by all the great Eastern teams. By only playing 5 games a season, the Eastern schools would still be playing around 10 games a season. In response to Michigan leaving, the Western Conference created a rule that banned teams from playing schools that had withdrawn from their conference. Though this move was probably smart for the football program, other athletic teams at Michigan suffered during this time. These other sport teams found it difficult to schedule non-Western Conference opponents, and without the big regional rivalries that they had been a part of, attendance to those events dropped significantly. This led to the school going back on their decision in 1917 and being re-invited into the conference. Though they felt like they needed to return, Yost and many people at Michigan would agree that leaving the conference at the time was still the right move for them. While Michigan was independent, Yost was finding great success in his business ventures. He worked in many different industries, typically working as some sort of director or consultant for a company. Some of the industries he worked for included a large power company, a cement company. He worked in banking, and even furniture manufacturing. He would even still return to the oil and gas industries too. He did this all while earning a very generous salary as a football coach. During Michigan's time as an independent, they would go 52, 16, and 7. Not too bad, but not nearly as dominant as they were before leaving the conference. This period would also change Michigan's rivals, from a team like Chicago to the rivals you see today, like Ohio State and Michigan State. Neither of those teams at the time were in the Big Ten, which meant Michigan could still play them. Going into the 1920s, Yost's business ventures started not to perform as well as they previously were. Luckily for him, the NCAA was pushing for all part-time coaches to take other full-time positions at the university. This, coupled with the fact that they were rejoining the Western Conference, made Yost strongly consider taking on the position as Michigan's new athletic director. After rejoining the conference, they won all 5 of their games, and it started to look like the old Michigan again, going back to their earlier years of dominance. Then in 1919, Yost had his only losing season in his entire career, going 3-4-1. Many factors may have contributed to this. Many of his business ventures were starting to struggle financially. The influenza pandemic was also sweeping the world, infecting nearly a third of the world's population. After the 1919 losing season, Yost would take extra measures to prepare and regain his focus. He would leave his business ventures behind and become athletic director in 1921, a position he had to fight very hard to get for the same reasons people always complained about Yost. He was cocky and arrogant, and he loved to be in the public eye. Regardless, he was a great businessman and proved time and time again that he was more prepared than anyone else when it came to the things he was passionate about. After that losing season, he would go to fraternities on campus to make sure that they were persuading their most athletic members to try out. He would also get with professors on campus to make sure people interested in the team were making good enough grades to play, and if they weren't, he would get them tutoring so that they could catch up. For the next few years, Yost and Michigan would go back to dominating teams and would even claim the 1918 and 1923 national championships. In 1924, Yost decided to step down and focus solely on being athletic director. This would end up being difficult for a guy like Yost, with such a high ego. The media and public would be confused before the 1924 season about who was the new coach of Michigan. It was supposed to be George Little, who had been an assistant coach for Yost for the past couple of seasons. The problem was that Yost kind of made it seem at times that he wasn't stepping down, it was still coaching the team. He wouldn't technically claim he was the coach, but he also would never deny that he wasn't the coach either. Yost loved the attention though, and would keep messing with the media until the start of the season when Little took the field with the team game 1. The season didn't go terribly, but they ended up having a really bad historic loss to Illinois. The worst part is that the game had a lot of attention. Illinois had a great player named Red Grange at the time. He was nicknamed the Galloping Ghost. In the game, Grange had a total of 409 yards and 5 touchdowns. 262 of those yards came from just 4 plays. This was said to be the best college football performance in a single game ever at the time. Yost was at the game, and the performance was killing him. He called the coach after the game and told him that he would be coming back. There have been theories in the past that Yost actually stayed as coach that season and only acted like Little was the coach once he was embarrassed by the Illinois loss. But no one knows for sure. Yost would go on to continuously bash George Little because of this game, to the point where Little had to speak up to Yost. Little would go on to say that he was only trying his best to help Yost and the school, and never even wanted to replace Yost. He felt like he was unfairly looked down upon due to the outcome of that one game. Yost would come back for the 1925 and 1926 seasons, and after that would officially retire. But he would continue to run into problems, interfering with the coaches he hired. Imagine if Nick Saban retires after this season and becomes the athletic director of Alabama. How would any coach be able to come in and run the program the way they wanted to without Saban interfering? Former Michigan player Tad Wyman would coach the team from 1927 to 1928. He only had about 2 weeks notice before the 1927 season began, and in both years, Yost did the same thing where he'd make it seem like maybe he was going to be the coach and then say it was Tad at the last minute. Here's an example of how confusing he would make it. Yost would tell the media that he had been head coach until October 5th. Then in another interview, said that Wyman was the coach and that he was just an academic advisor. Then in another interview, Yost said that he was the head coach. Soon after that, Yost said that Wyman was the head coach again and that he had never said that he was the coach. You can see how this was probably confusing for Wyman and the Michigan team, but Yost loved messing with the media. After going 3-4-1 in 1928, Wyman was fired and Yost hired Harry Kipke. Yost started to take a little bit more of a step back to focus on the athletic director's duties. Kipke would have some great seasons, going undefeated 3 times, but would be fired in 1937 after a string of losing seasons. Little, Wyman, and Kipke would all have fairly successful careers in athletics. Many of Yost's most lasting impacts to the University of Michigan came during his time as the athletic director. He loved Michigan. It would make it his life goal to build up the university as much as he could. He was responsible for the building of the first ever field house, and even was able to get it named after himself. The sports facilities they had on campus at the time were used by all students and faculty and were often overcrowded. Yost fought to build a huge facility to practice in. People thought he was crazy that he wanted one big enough to punt in. Being detail-oriented, Yost made sure every aspect of the build was how he wanted. He would work closely with the engineers, financiers, and builders. When they finished building the field house, it was the largest building on campus. The fieldhouse was estimated to cost around $225,000. Well, it ended up costing $563,000. Michigan was able to pay the fieldhouse off in only 3 years though, due to profits from football. Demand for football was much greater than the supply. It was becoming a larger and larger issue. As athletic director for Yost, fans were becoming agitated because they couldn't go to the games. Even big name people were trying to attend games, such as Henry Ford, owner of the Ford Motor Company. How could they get big names like this into the stadium if there were not enough seats? Yost was able to use these profits from football as leverage to convince the university to build a new stadium. Yost was addicted to stadiums and wanted Michigan to have the biggest in the country. The book he wrote in 1905 was full of pictures of college football stadiums. His main selling point was that for their athletic programs to survive, they needed to make the football program as profitable as possible so that they could pay for them. He also didn't want to get outdone by other rival schools. Both Ohio State and Illinois had anywhere from 70,000 to 80,000 seat stadiums at the time. The stadium would be built in 1927. Financing for the stadium was done using bonds that people could purchase. This was a strategy other schools had found success in for their stadium builds. A seating capacity of 70,000 was agreed upon. Footing was constructed so that the stadium could be later increased to 100,000 seats. Yost had 15,000 seats worth of wooden bleachers put in to increase the capacity to 85,000 people, making it the largest football stadium in the country. Yost oversaw the construction of the stadium up to the last detail. He would even examine the bricks they used to make sure they met his standards. The Big House is even today the largest stadium in the country, hosting crowds of around 115,000 people at its peak. Michigan was able to get the stadium built just before the Great Depression. This is interesting because if that didn't happen, Michigan's football program could likely look a lot different than it does today. Just for comparison, the University of Chicago, their biggest rival at the time, which was a powerhouse, decided not to renovate its stadium and focus more on academics. After the Great Depression, they had to discontinue their football team, and they didn't continue it again until 1969. They're now a Division III team. Other facilities Yost would help build included the baseball stadium, their hockey rink, their golf course. Yost would end up retiring in 1940, turning over his position to coach Fritz Kreisler, who would also later become a Michigan legend, building off of what Yost had helped create. Probably the biggest controversy that we need to talk about involving Fielding Yost was with Willis Ward in 1934. Willis had been the first black player since 1892 at Michigan. They were set this season to play Georgia Tech at home. At the time, Southern schools didn't allow black athletes on their team, nor did they play teams who did. When a Northern team played a Southern team at the time, it was customary for the Northern team to bench its black players. Yost didn't have a good history when it came to this issue. He had never had a black player on his team, and he tended to be a segregationist. And he was also a close friend of the Georgia Tech coach at the time. So his plan was to have Willis sit out that game. Willis was a great player that season. This would spark a huge race issue within the university and create a morale problem on the team. Most of the team members didn't agree with this decision and cared a lot for Willis. They felt like it wasn't right. Future president Gerald Ford, who was a player on the team, would room with Willis on away games, and he said that Willis was probably my closest friend on the team. Ford agonized over whether or not he should even play for the team or quit. Willis urged him to keep playing, according to Ford, for the benefit of the team. This messed up the team morale though for the rest of the season, and they would struggle. Yost claimed that he didn't realize the impact this would have on the school and the team, and he said he wished he hadn't sat out Ward. He would also mention that he felt like it was his duty as the host school to be accommodating to Georgia Tech. In all fairness to the university, the Michigan student body protested this decision well before the game even started. Francis M. Dent, a Detroit lawyer, wrote to Ralph Eigler, a member of the board in control of athletics, saying that Michigan should fight against intolerance and not sit out Ward. Ralph Eigler replied that as a good host, Michigan should consider the feelings of Georgia Tech. Well, Dent responded to this, saying that the best universities in the country don't get looked down upon because they do what's right. Joseph H.B. Evans, a Michigan grad, also wrote to him with a brilliant response, essentially saying that by sitting Ward, Michigan was treating him as if he was a family dog that they put outside when a guest comes over that doesn't like dogs. He went on to say that if it were their daughter, someone who was part of their family, they would never put her outside just because a guest didn't want him around. If Ward was truly part of the Michigan family to them, they would not sit him for this game, regardless of what their guests had to say about it. There were campaigns before the game to even stop this. There were protests planned to disrupt the game. Yost had hired private investigators who confirmed these rumors and tried to de-escalate the protests. To say Yost didn't think this was going to be a big deal is crazy. The precedent for a decision like this, though, was on Yost's side, which probably made him more comfortable with his decision, with other schools doing this in the past. However, the newer generation of students and faculty didn't care about precedent and didn't want their university represented as not being accepting to all cultures. Though like many humans, he had his flaws. Fielding Yost was a legendary college football coach who loved Michigan with all of his heart and wanted to help grow Michigan in the sport of football as much as he could. It's safe to say that he was a great innovator for football and also one of the greatest program builders in all of college sports. Yost passed away in 1946 and was buried in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Since then, what he built at Michigan has stood the test of time. If he could see all the success that the program has had since he's passed, I believe he would still be extremely proud to be a Michigan Wolverine.
It's a great beam, it's a great beam, it's a great big Michigan day. It's a great big Michigan day, a great big Michigan day. Who are they that they should dream that they can beat our Michigan team? It's a great big Michigan day, and Michigan men all say.
Thank you for watching the College Football History channel. If you like what you see, please like and subscribe. I would love to hear any suggestions you have as a listener to make the show even better. Also, if you have any topics you'd like me to look further into, feel free to reach out.
It's a great